my talk is about predictive language processing and cross-linguistic influence in different groups of bilingual children. And this is part of my PhD project. So the outline of my talk today, first I will spend a few words on predictive language processing. What is it and how can we test it? Then I will turn to grammatical gender and how it works in Italian mainly. Then I will present a few previous studies on processing of grammatical gender in bilinguals, one focusing on adults and one focusing on children. And then I will present two studies in which I have been involved. One on German-Italian bilingual children. This study was conducted together with Francesca Poppolo. And then a second study on Mandarin Chinese speaking children who learned Italian as their second language in comparison with Italian monolingual children. And this study was conducted together with Mathilde Chailleux, Jaen Yi, Maria Teresa Guasti, and Fabrizio Arosio. Predictive language processing, what do we mean with this? Well, we know that people are very efficient in the way in which they process language because listeners anticipate upcoming words as they listen to a sentence because they rely on linguistic cues. And evidence for this type of processing comes from studies, from eye tracking studies using the visual world paradigm. I will give you a few examples of this. So in this classic study by Altman and Kamide, participants saw a visual scenario and they saw with one person in it and several objects, and then they heard a sentence such as, the boy will eat the cake. And in this example, they found that participants already started looking at the cake as soon as they heard the verb eat, because they rely on the lexical meaning of the verb to anticipate the upcoming noun. Because the cake, as you can see, is the only edible object in the scene. So this must be the word that comes next. In contrast, this is not the case if you hear the sentence, the boy will move the cake. Then you need to wait until the end of the sentence before you can, you know what will come next. So the assumption here is that your eye, what you look at, reveals what you are thinking of. And this provides evidence for relying on a lexical cue, but people can also rely on more grammatical type of cues. For example, in this follow-up experiment, participants could anticipate on the basis of lexical information on the verb. On morphosyntactic information of the verb, the temporal information expressed by the auxiliary. Because you see in this example, you see an empty wine glass, a full beer glass, some candies, and some cheese. And if you hear the man has drunk the wine, first of all, you know, as in the previous task, you know that the following word must be a drink rather than some food because of the lexical meaning of the verb. But moreover, you can also anticipate that it will be the empty wine glass because has drunk indicates that the drinking has been completed. So it must be the empty glass rather than the full glass. So this makes language processing very fast and efficient, at least in native speakers, because there's a bit more debate about bilingual speakers. There's a lot of research on adults learning a second language, and there are some studies that suggest that in some cases, adult second language learners may show weaker predictive processing, or they may be less likely to use these type of cues to the same extent as native speakers. Although this is also related to language proficiency and, for example, the degree of similarity and differences between the two languages. But in general, there is very little research on children, on child L2 learners and bilingual children. So this is one of the reasons why we conducted these studies. So grammatical gender is one morphosyntactic cue that can be used to anticipate upcoming nouns, upcoming words. And grammatical gender is does not exist in English. So if I show you these pictures and I ask you, where is the banana? You need to wait until I say banana before you know how the sentence will end. And you yeah, so the article does not provide any information about the next noun. However, if I had asked this sentence in Italian, it would have been dove la banana. And because in Italian, articles are marked for grammatical gender, so you can rely on the article la to pre-select the banana, because a banana is feminine in Italian and a sandwich, the panino, is masculine in Italian. So you can anticipate based on the gender of the article. It's important to remember that grammatical gender is arbitrary. It's an arbitrary division of nouns into certain classes, which exist in many languages of the world, not in English. And this may also sometimes have some morphosyntactic implications for other words in the sentence, because there is gender agreement. And in Italian, there's a lot of, the nouns agree with many different elements in the sentence, but we will focus on articles here. Let's go on. Yes. So we know that native speakers of gender-marked languages, such as Italian or Spanish or French, rely on gender cues to anticipate nouns as in the example that I just showed you. And in most languages, grammatical gender is acquired early by monolingual children. So for example, in Italian, the production of grammatical gender is correct 75% of the time by the age of 3 with familiar words. And children are at ceiling by the age of 6. And monolingual toddlers also rely on gender cues in spoken word recognition. So we have evidence with Spanish 3-year-olds and French 2-year-olds even that children can rely on the gender of the article, and that this facilitates the subsequent recognition of the following noun. But even though it is such an early acquired phenomenon in most languages, for L2 learners, both adults and children, grammatical gender seems to be quite challenging. And even when production and comprehension of gender are on target, in proficient L2 speakers, processing may sometimes be different. And this may result in weaker predictive processing or in different ERP responses to gender agreement violations. So I am a second language learner of Italian, and I know that it is la banana and not il banana. So I know how to do this correctly, say this correctly, but maybe I will not have the same automatic response in my brain when someone says il banana as a native speaker of Italian would have. But gender processing in second language speakers is influenced by many things, such as language proficiency. So the more proficient you are, the more native-like you become probably. And also by linguistic differences between the first and the second language. So it seemed to be more difficult to acquire native-like processing of grammatical gender if your first language does not have grammatical gender. So it may be more difficult for a native English speaker who learns Italian than for a native speaker of Spanish or German. And when both languages have grammatical gender, there may be for specific words, there may be a mismatch. So this can lead to cross-linguistic interference. This is what we call the gender congruency effect, because as I said, gender is largely arbitrary. So when a speaker speaks two gender-marked languages, the gender of a word does not always overlap. So there may be cross-linguistic influence. In this example, we see an Italian-Spanish bilingual speaker who thinks of a monkey. A monkey has a feminine grammatical gender in Italian and masculine in Spanish. So there may be some influence from the native language on the second language in this case. When listening to sentences in one of the languages. So Morales et al. In 2016 investigated exactly this. They tested high proficient Italian-Spanish bilinguals, so Italian native speakers who were proficient second language learners of Spanish, and they compared them to monolingual Spanish speakers. And they used an eye tracking experiment in which participants saw two pictures, and they heard sentences in Spanish asking them to search for one of the pictures on the screen. And there were two conditions. So in the congruence condition, which we see on the left, both objects had the same grammatical gender in Spanish and in Italian. So the article would not provide any informative cue, and there was no influence from Italian on Spanish possible, actually. So this is really the control condition. And on the right, we have the incongruence condition, in which in Spanish also both objects have the same grammatical gender, but in Italian, one of the objects has the opposite grammatical gender. So they wanted to test here whether Italian-Spanish bilinguals were influenced by their knowledge of the Italian grammatical gender system when processing nouns in Spanish. So they would expect a delay here for the bilinguals. So here are their results. With the graph you see here is this figure shows the time, like the eye movements or the eye movement pattern for bilingual speakers. So for the Spanish monolingual speakers, there was no difference between the congruence and the incongruence condition as expected. But for bilingual speakers, on the y-axis, you see the proportion of target fixations, and on the x-axis, you see the time. The gray line is the congruence condition, in which there's no cross-linguistic interference possible, and the black line is the incongruence condition. So as you can see, the two conditions diverge at a certain point. They are slower in the incongruence condition, in which there can be cross-linguistic interference from Italian. So so this is evidence that there was interference from Italian when processing gender-marked articles and nouns in Spanish. Okay, so let's now go to bilingualism in children. So the general assumption in the field is that bilingual children develop two separate linguistic systems, but that there may still be some degree of interaction, which we call cross-linguistic influence. And the degree of cross-linguistic influence may depend on many different things, but the most important ones being the differences and similarities between the two languages, but also type of acquisition. So were the two languages learned simultaneously, or did children start with one language and was the other added as an L2? And also language dominance. So language dominance may refer to relative language proficiency of bilinguals, or to differences in the frequency of language use and input. Well, in practice, these, of course, very often are related to each other. If you have more input, you are also likely to be more proficient in a certain language. But previous research has shown that cross-linguistic influence is more likely to be observed when children are tested in their less dominant language. So the stronger language is more likely to influence the weaker language than vice versa. So there's one study that looked at predictive processing and the gender congruency effect in bilingual children by Lemmerth Hopp, 2019. And they focused on Russian-German bilingual 8 and 9-year-olds. Their main goal was to investigate the effect of type of bilingual acquisition. So they compared 3 groups: simultaneous Russian-German bilinguals, who had one Russian parent and one German parent. Then early sequential bilinguals who were growing up in Russian families in Germany and who were exposed to German before the age of 4, for example, when they entered daycare or preschool. And then there was a German monolingual control group. And all these children were born and raised in Germany. A little bit of information now about Russian and German, so we understand their study better. So Russian and German both mark grammatical gender, and they have a similar system in that there are 3 classes. So they have masculine, feminine, and neuter gender, but gender is expressed in a different way. German has gender-marked articles and adjectives that precede nouns, and in Russian there are no articles, but gender is marked differently, but it's also marked on adjectives and on nouns. So a second purpose of this study was to investigate the effect of linguistic differences and similarities, to see whether there was stronger predictive processing based on adjectives than on articles in Russian-German bilinguals, because there may be a positive transfer from the L1 or from Russian, let's say. Okay, so first they used production tasks in Russian and in German to test whether their children knew all the words and their gender. And they asked children to describe the display, the nouns of the words they saw on the screen. So yeah, here, this is the green clock, this is the blue sun, etc. And they would do this in Russian and in German. Then they had 2 eye tracking tasks in German, both in German, one testing articles and one testing adjectives. Here I will just show you the one with articles because it's most relevant for us today. They would hear a sentence in German asking them to search for one of the objects. And in the predictable condition, the target could be pre-selected before the onset of the noun because it was the only object with this particular gender. And in the unpredictable condition, the target could only be selected when hearing the noun. So here, children would have to wait until they heard the noun before they could move their eyes towards the target. Okay. So let's go to the results. In general, they found very high accuracy. In German, there was no difference between the 2 groups, 98% correct. And there was no effect of German-Russian gender congruency. So it did not matter whether German and Russian had the same grammatical gender. It did not matter for accuracy. And then in Russian, they found that sequential bilinguals outperformed simultaneous bilinguals. But again, there was no effect of gender congruency. Okay, then the eye tracking task. So they found that both monolingual German children and simultaneous Russian-German bilinguals anticipated nouns based on the grammatical gender of the article. But sequential bilingual children, those who started learning German outside of the house, only did so when German and Russian had the same grammatical gender. So this represents a gender congruency effect. They were influenced by their knowledge of Russian when processing sentences in German. And in general, there was no difference between adjectives and articles. So there was no, it did not provide evidence for an effect of structural linguistic differences on the gender congruency effect. Okay, so their conclusion was that this group difference is due to the type of bilingual acquisition. So the interpretation is that simultaneous bilinguals have 2 separate gender systems that are less likely to influence each other, whereas sequential bilinguals have an L1 system that is already partly in place when to which the L2 system is then added. So this would allow for more cross-linguistic influence, or would make it more likely to occur. But as the authors point out themselves, this is not the only difference between the two groups, because they also differ in terms of language dominance. So recall that the simultaneous bilinguals grew up with one Russian and one German parent in Germany, which means that they probably received a lot more input in German in their life because they all went to German schools. Whereas the sequential bilinguals were probably a lot more balanced because they spoke Russian at home and German at school. So this pattern was also confirmed by the results of the production task. It seems that they have a similar proficiency in German, but sequential bilinguals seem to be more proficient in Russian, at least with respect to their knowledge of the grammatical gender system. So language dominance may also play a very important role. And this is one of the this is one of the aims of our first study. So we decided to test this by focusing on German-Italian bilingual children living either in Italy or in Germany, which means that we had a very large range of differences in language dominance. And we aimed to test predictive processing and to see whether whether there was a gender congruency effect. So German and Italian differ in the sense that Italian only has masculine and feminine gender, whereas German also has neutral gender. But they are more similar in the way in which they express grammatical gender, because they both mark they both mark grammatical gender on articles that precede nouns, also on many other elements in the sentence, but this is what matters for our experiment. So our research questions are as follows. First, do Italian-German bilingual children anticipate nouns on the basis of grammatical gender of articles in Italian and in German? Is there cross-linguistic influence when the two languages have a different grammatical gender of a certain word? And what is the effect of language dominance, which we assessed by looking at their relative vocabulary size? So we had two experiments. First, an Italian experiment, which was conducted in both countries, and a German experiment, which was only conducted in Germany. So there were 64 children in the end who participated in the Italian task between the ages of 6 and 10, and 25 children who participated in the German task. And they all attended bilingual schools. So this is where we tested them also. And I will now show you what our experiments look like, what our materials look like. We had 3 conditions, and this is the first one, the no prediction condition, which, as the name says, does not allow for any prediction. It's the control condition, in which both pictures, both objects, have the same grammatical gender in both languages. So there's no prediction possible, and there is no cross-linguistic interference possible. And I will play, I hope you can hear it. I will try to play the audio for you.
Dov'è la carota?
I'm not sure if you heard this, but it's okay, great. So it's as you heard, we sort of try to make it sound like a guessing game, to engage the children and to make it like a game, and also to have some a bit of time in between the onset of the article and the onset of the noun, so that which would allow us to observe any anticipatory looks towards the target picture. and while still making it sound natural. Okay, so then,
Dov'è la?
sorry. Secondly, we had the congruent prediction condition, in which one of the pictures was masculine and one was feminine. So you could anticipate the noun based on the gender of the article, but the gender in German and Italian was the same. So you would not expect any interference here. So I'll play it for you.
Dov'è la fragola?
Yeah, so here the strawberry is feminine in both Italian and German, and the mushroom is masculine in both languages. And then the third condition is here we have the prediction incongruent condition, in which there is interference possible. So we have here the children would hear, "Where is the mouse?" And you would see, so a mouse is masculine in Italian, but feminine in German. And on the other side, we have the butterfly, which is feminine in Italian, but masculine in German. So the exact opposite. So here we expect that children can anticipate the noun, but we also expect that there may be cross-linguistic influence from Italian in the German experiments and vice versa. Okay.
Dov'è il topo?
Okay, so here just an overview of our experimental design to make sure it is clear. We had the no prediction condition, in which no anticipation was possible and no cross-linguistic influence was expected. There was the prediction congruent condition, in which children could anticipate based on the article, but it was the same in German and Italian, so no cross-linguistic influence expected. And then there was the prediction incongruent condition, in which children could anticipate the noun based on the article, but there is a mismatch between German and Italian, so there may be cross-linguistic influence. So we expect an increase of the looks to the target during the article in predictable conditions as compared to the no prediction control condition. And we expect less looks to the target in the prediction incongruent condition than in the prediction congruent condition during the article because of cross-linguistic influence. And then we expect that both this prediction effect and the gender congruency effect are influenced by language dominance. So we expect stronger prediction and less cross-linguistic influence when children are tested in their dominant language. So we tested children using the Peabody picture vocabulary test in Italian and in German. And we computed balance scores to have a measure of language dominance by subtracting the standard score on the German task from the standard score on the Italian task. So these were our balance scores. And then we divided the sentences, the experimental sentences, into time regions. The introduction, which was dov'è in Italian, wo ist in German. The article, so which was either feminine or masculine. And then the noun. And there was always exactly 1 second between the onset of the article and the onset of the noun. And then we used generalized linear mixed effect models to look whether the odds of looking at the target versus the competitor were influenced by time region, condition, and language dominance, and the interaction between these predictors. So let's move to our results. Here in this figure, on the y-axis, you see the proportion of looks to the target picture, as opposed to the competitor picture. And on the x-axis, you see the time. The first dotted vertical line represents the onset of the article. And the second dotted line is the onset of the noun. So as you can see, in all three conditions, children are around chance during the introduction, during dove, or yeah. But they start in the blue and the green line. Those are the two predictable conditions. Here, children start directing their gaze towards the target picture during the article time region, before the onset of the noun. So this means that children are anticipating. And moreover, the green line is above the blue line. So they are faster in the congruent condition than in the incongruent condition, in which there is a mismatch between Italian and German. So we found significant prediction effects and also significant gender congruency effects. Yeah, this can be seen by the difference between the blue and the green line. And we also found that both of these effects were significantly modulated by language dominance, because Italian dominant children showed a stronger prediction effect and less interference from German. Then we wanted to split up the two groups, the children living in Italy and the children living in Germany. And as you can see, they show a very different pattern. So on the left, you see are the children who grow up in Italy. And they show very clear prediction in both the congruent and the incongruent predictable condition. Although they are still a little bit faster in the congruent condition than in the incongruent condition. So there's still, and this was also significant, so there's still some gender congruency effect. But it is a very different pattern from the one we see on the right with the children growing up in Germany. As you can see, it's also messier, this plot, because it was a smaller group. But it seems to suggest that children clearly anticipate in the condition in which there is overlap between German and Italian, the prediction congruence condition, the green line. But it's not so clear for the prediction incongruent condition. Maybe there's still some facilitation, but whether there is really any prediction, it doesn't really seem to be the case. Then we also wanted to focus on simultaneous bilingual children only, because this was something that was investigated in previous research. We wanted to see whether we would observe a gender congruency effect. And as you can see, there is a very clear one. So children are much faster in the green prediction congruence condition than in the condition in which there is interference possible from German. But this is probably the case because there were more simultaneous bilingual children in Germany. In Italy, the group was more varied in terms of their type of bilingual acquisition. There were also many Italian children who started, who were early sequential bilinguals of German. Okay, so then the German task. As you can see, there's clearly a significant prediction effect in the predictable condition. They start looking at the targets before the onset of the noun. But here we found no difference between the congruent and the incongruent condition. So we did not observe interference from Italian to German in our German task. But recall that this was only administered in Germany. So with more German dominant children, probably. With respect to language dominance, we also found that German dominant children showed significantly stronger predictions than Italian dominant children in the German task. But in general, our study suggests that these bilingual children anticipated nouns on the basis of articles, and that we observed a gender congruency effect in an Italian task, but not in a German task. Yes, as I said, this could be because the participants in a German task were mostly German dominant, or also maybe because it was simply a smaller sample size than the group that was tested with the Italian task. And it clearly suggests that language dominance matters. So we found stronger predictive processing in Italian for Italian dominant children than for German dominant children. And we found stronger predictive processing in German for German dominant children than for Italian dominant children. And finally, more cross-linguistic influence from German to Italian for German dominant children. We did, in contrast to previous research, we found a gender congruency effect in simultaneous bilingual children. So this would suggest that cross-linguistic influence in gender processing may in fact also occur in bilingual children who acquired both systems simultaneously. But there are several limitations that should be acknowledged. First of all, we did not have a production task. So even though we used simple words that we believe that are known even by the youngest participants, we cannot be completely sure that all children knew all words and their grammatical gender. Yeah, even though hopefully this would be this problem would be partly solved by the fact that we have random intercepts for item and subject. This is a limitation that should be acknowledged. Then we did also not test neuter gender in German. So to get a more complete picture, it would be interesting for future studies to focus on this. Thirdly, our task also included some cognates. And cognates are known to be processed faster by bilingual speakers than non-cognates. And it may also lead to stronger interference. So maybe this is also why we observed such a strong effect in our experiments. But it should be noted that at least the cognates were evenly divided over the 3 experimental conditions. Okay, so let's then turn to our second study. In their second study, we focused on Mandarin Italian bilingual children. And we did not only look at anticipation based on grammatical gender, but also based on number. And we compared these bilingual children to monolingual Italian children. So, here, as I said, in Italian, articles are also marked for number. So here, remember that I said that I showed you the picture of the banana and the sandwich, in which you can anticipate the noun by relying on the gender of the article. The same is possible with number. So la banana is feminine singular, le banane is feminine plural, and the same is true for masculine gender. You also have a singular and a plural form of the article. So the comparison between of the combination of Italian and Mandarin is interesting because Italian marks grammatical gender and number on articles, but Mandarin does not have articles, and it does not have grammatical gender either. But it does, of course, have a conceptual notion of number, and it also has different ways to express this grammatically, albeit in a different way than in Italian. So this was an interesting opportunity to study predictive processing in bilingual children whose languages have greater typological distance than the Italian-German group. So our research questions are as follows. How do Mandarin Italian bilingual children compare to monolingual Italian children in the way in which they anticipate nouns based on articles, the gender and number of articles. Secondly, is there a difference between gender and number processing? And thirdly, is predictive processing related to second language proficiency of the bilingual participants? So we tested 25 children, 25 bilingual children. They were native Mandarin Chinese speakers, and they were early L2 learners of Italian. So they grew up in the Chinese community in Milan, which is quite a closed community in which children are really only exposed to Italian when they enter preschool. So most of these children were exposed to Italian at the age of 3. And they all attend a Chinese heritage language school during the weekend. And this is where we also tested them. We also administered the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test in Italian with these children. And this showed that their proficiency was in fact a lot lower than that of the German-Italian bilinguals in the study that I just presented. And then we compared them to 32 Italian monolingual children. All children were between the ages of 8 and 12 in this study. So our experiment was similar to the one that I showed you before, but not exactly the same. So here, participants again saw 2 pictures and they heard the sentence in Italian, now find the blah, blah, blah. So there are, on the left, we see the early gender condition, which is very similar to the predictable conditions that I presented in the previous study. So children can anticipate the noun by relying on the gender of the article. Then in the middle, we see the early number condition, in which children could anticipate nouns based on the number marking of the article. So if you hear la folie versus les sedie, if you hear la, you know that there must be a singular object. So then you can already start looking at the leaf rather than the 2 chairs. And then on the right, we have the control condition, which we call the late condition in this experiment. And here no prediction is possible. So these are the 2 predictable conditions. Again, we divided the sentence into time regions. The first the introduction, adesso trova, then the article, which was either la, il, or le, and in which there was always 750 milliseconds between the onset of the article and the onset of the noun. And then the third time region was the noun. Yeah, again, we used generalized linear mixed effect models. And we focused on the comparison between the looks to the target, the odds of looking at the target in the introduction versus the article time region. And then in step 1, we compared the monolingual group with the bilingual group in their ability to anticipate nouns. And then in the second step, we focused on bilinguals only, taking into account the effects of language proficiency as measured by their vocabulary test scores. So here are the results. On the left, we see the monolinguals. It's a similar type of figure. So the first line represents the onset of the article. The second vertical dotted line is the onset of the noun. So as you can see, monolinguals, they start looking at the article as they start looking at the target during the article in both predictable conditions, whereas the Mandarin Italian bilinguals seem to be somewhat delayed, especially in the gender condition, the early gender condition. And we found that the difference between gender and number processing was significantly greater for bilinguals than for monolinguals. So then we conducted a follow-up analysis. This group was slightly smaller because we had some missing data on the vocabulary test. So there were 21 bilingual children. And in this analysis, we found no significant prediction effect of nouns. We found no significant anticipation of nouns based on articles. Although we want to be a bit careful with this, since looking at the plot, well, at least in the number condition, there seems to be, the pattern seems to be there. So maybe we simply did not have enough data. I'm not sure. But what we did find was that the degree of anticipation based on grammatical gender was significantly related to vocabulary knowledge. So children who were more proficient in Italian were more likely to predict on the basis of grammatical gender. This study seems to suggest that for bilingual children, grammatical gender may be more difficult than number. And this could be interpreted in two different ways. First of all, you could look at L1 effects, because Mandarin has number but not gender. So maybe the bilingual children benefited from this when processing number. Or proficiency could play an important role, because vocabulary knowledge is more important for gender than for number. A number is very concretely linked to the referential context, whereas for gender, to be able which gender a noun has, that requires some lexical knowledge. So it's an arbitrary property, which may be more difficult because of that. And yeah, in fact, our finding that gender processing in bilinguals was related to their L2 proficiency scores seems to point towards that second explanation. But in fact, we cannot be sure about this. We cannot. Our experiment does not allow to distinguish between the two explanations for this gender number discrepancy. So maybe for future studies, it would be interesting to also focus on language pairs that have both have gender and number, to see if there is still this advantage of number processing over gender processing. And also in this experiment, one limitation is that we did not have a production task. But for now, based on these two studies, we can conclude that, like monolingual adults and children and high proficient second language speakers, bilingual children can in principle use predictive processing, but their language dominance seems to matter. And like bilingual adults, bilingual children may sometimes show cross-linguistic influence, especially when they are tested in their less dominant language. And so that I would like to thank my collaborators in both of these studies and everyone else who helped with this, collecting the data and making these studies possible. Thank you.